Thank you all for coming today. My name is Brecken Cardinal. I'm the Clinical Trials Administrator at HSD. So you're all here today to find out what we've been talking about, what we're going to do with the UW WIRB process and how we're changing it. So my presentation is pretty short, so there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end, so if you can hold off, or if you're just so super excited and can't wait, you can interrupt me, but we'll have plenty of time at the end. So I'll give you a little overview of what we're going to talk about. So I'll talk about the changes that we're making that affect the contract and budget processes. We will unveil our new consent template. I'll cover the HIPAA authorization changes that are HSD-wide, so you might have heard about some of these already. And then we'll discuss how confidentiality agreements are changing for WIRB studies. And then, like I said, at the end, we'll have time for questions. So I know you won't be able to read this from where you're sitting, but I just wanted to throw our current process map out because it is so complicated, so inefficient, and there's so many holding patterns in here. So here's the old, and this is our new process. Much simpler, much more efficient, and really no holding patterns at all. So you all have a copy of that, and this will be posted to our website as well. So I'm going to break down all of the individual changes that we're making that are all on the process map. So the beginning is going to remain the same. So you take the sponsor's template, you convert it into the UW WIRB template, you send it to the sponsor. Sponsor agrees. You submit that, the protocol, and the request authorization to HSD. I'll do the initial modifications like we always have. If I'm negotiating directly with the sponsor, I'll send it to the sponsor directly. If you are being the mediator in between us, I'll send it back to you. Sponsor reviews, hopefully they agree to everything, then it comes back to HSD. That's all the same. So at this point, we would normally go into one of the holding patterns. So we'd be holding for the contract or for the budget. But we're getting rid of all of that. So HSD is removing itself from all of the contract and budget steps. So we will no longer be reviewing the contract against the consent form. So no need to wait for the contract before you can submit to WIRB. So it is now going to be, yay! It is now going to be a concurrent process. So you can submit to OSP and have the budget or the contract negotiations going on. You can submit to WIRB and have the IRB review going on, and hopefully by the time that you finish, it's around the same time, you get your contract finalized, you get your IRB approval, and you're good to go. So the current process, as you're all very well aware, there's a lot of back and forth. So we hold and we wait for the contract, and that usually takes a good amount of time. Contract comes in, I compare the compensation for injury section to the contract language that has to do with subject injury. There's almost always changes. So I redline those in, send them back to you or send them to the sponsor. There's usually more than one back and forth on that language. So that's why there's the loop here. We finally come to agreement on the consent form, and then I sign off. So we're eliminating all of that. We're also eliminating our budget review. So like I said before, we're removing ourselves from CRBB's budget process. So you still have to submit to CRBB, and actually you're going to be submitting to CRBB first now. They want to review the UW WIRB consent template, so you won't be submitting the sponsor template anymore. You'll be converting theirs into ours and then submitting that with your budget review. In their budget review, they'll request changes to the consent form if any are necessary. You'll get those in place, and then you'll submit to HSD. So we're eliminating the same thing that we're doing for the contract. Previously, I was waiting for the budget summary. The budget summary comes in. I make sure that CRBB's changes to the consent form are, in fact, included in the consent form, and if not, then we go through the whole sponsor loop again. And then finally, when we're in agreement, we go to sign off. So eliminating all of that. So this is going to be our new process. So you submit to the sponsor, get their pre-approval, submit to HSD. If I have any modifications, I'll make those at the time, but I'm thinking there's going to be way, way less modifications that just have to do with the template, and we'll talk about the template in a second. If there are changes, we'll go through the sponsor again, and then back to HSD, and then finally to sign off. So what does this mean for you? We're going to be cutting down on the back and forth between HSD and the sponsor because we're no longer waiting for the budget and doing the changes with the budget summary. We're no longer waiting for the contract, doing the changes with the contract. So more time for you. And then the overall turnaround time, because we're eliminating those two huge time-consuming pieces, is going to go down dramatically. So with our current metrics from the last 6 months of 2014, the average turnaround time for the whole process, so from when you submit to HSD sign-off, including the budget and contract holding periods, was 14.5 business days. So we're predicting that the new process is going to take it down to 2 business days. So saving you time and then saving overall study startup time for the process as the whole. So the next big change is the new consent template. So WIRB has already approved a new consent template. It has much less required language in it. There's very few spots that have required language in it, actually. The thing I'm most excited about, and I think you will be too, is that there's more flexibility allowed. So you can take the sponsor's language and plop it right into our consent template. You don't have to modify it so that it meets our standards in our template. You can use their language. And then we're also getting rid of the CPU template. So does everybody in here know what CPU stands for? Okay. Just in case there was somebody doing this. It's Clinical Pharmacology Unit. So we previously had 2 separate templates. So if you were doing CPU and non-CPU studies, you had to figure out which one was which and which template language you needed to be using. We've done away with that. So now there's just one template for all studies. So the impact of this change, I think that the previous consent template wasn't very clear on what was required language and what was suggested language. So now it is crystal clear. It is red font. If there's red font, you can't change it, and it has to be in there, if applicable. Because we're allowing you to use the sponsor's template language in a lot of areas, there should be less editing that you have to do in order to get it into our template. And then, again, because you're using the sponsor's language, there should be fewer back and forths. You're using the sponsor's language, you send it back to the sponsor, and they're thrilled that you get their language is what's going to be used in the IRB approved consent form. So now these are the HIPAA changes. So these are HSD-wide, so if you have any studies that are being reviewed by the UW-IRB, these would also apply. So one thing that I'm very excited about is we have a new HIPAA authorization template, and I'm sure you all know sponsors are very picky about what they want in the HIPAA authorization template, and it's very rigid. So over the last couple of years, I kept track of changes that I was seeing from sponsors frequently, that they came up more than once and seemed to make sense to me. So I kept a red line. And then I also highlighted areas of the HIPAA authorization that seemed to cause a lot of confusion, so there was always edits because we weren't talking about the same thing. So those went through the review process, and a lot of them are now in our HIPAA authorization template. And we also, at the suggestion of many researchers, created a pregnant partner template. The HIPAA authorization was really hard to force into a pregnant partner template on a case-by-case basis. So now we just have a template that you can use for all of your studies that require that you collect information from pregnant partners. And then the big change that was just announced is that HSD and the IRBs are no longer reviewing HIPAA authorizations. So you still need to use the proper form. You need to use the UW Medicine template. You can't make any changes to it except in the highlighted section. This is the same way it's always been. But once you get it approved by the sponsor, if they require it, some sponsors don't care about HIPAA. There are not very many of them, but some of them don't. And then you're done. It doesn't go to HSD, it doesn't go to WIRB, it doesn't go to the UW-IRB. So if you have any changes that are coming up, oh, you didn't know?
You just blew my mind.
if you have any changes to your HIPAA authorizations coming up, you don't need to submit those either. So once you get your HIPAA created, it's done. It's ready to use for subjects. So what this means for you is we're completely cutting out the whole back and forth that HSD does with the sponsor on the HIPAA authorization. And because a lot of the changes in the new HIPAA authorization template are from what sponsors have been asking for the last couple of years, hopefully you'll have less back and forth or fewer back and forth with the sponsor as well. And our last change has to do with confidentiality agreements and the sequence in which they are submitted to our office. So currently, you can't submit your confidentiality agreement until you have IRB approval and you have the approved consent waiver and HIPAA waiver. And so those are at the very end. Well, we're flip-flopping it now. So when you submit to HSD your pre-review materials by email, you can mail your confidentiality agreement at the same time. So prior to IRB approval, you don't need to send, you won't have an IRB approval. So it's just the confidentiality agreement, and then I'm asking the people to put a sticky note or something on there to let me know who to send it back to. So that's another big change. And this is going to allow you to start pre-screening sooner. So before you had IRB approval and then you had this one last step that you had to complete before you could start screening records. Now, once you have IRB approval and your contract is finalized, you're ready to start screening. So this is our transition plan. So if you have a study that you're getting ready to submit or that it's currently in my office waiting for a contract or waiting for a budget or waiting for sponsor review of something, it's going to follow the old process and the old template. Anything after June 1st is the new process and new template. So if you submit something, if I approve something on May 29th and you submit it to WIRB on May 29th, they're going to follow the old process. They're checking for that using our review, our request authorization. So they're going by hand and checking the date that it was submitted to my office to make sure that they're following the old process or the new process. So in summary, HSD has completely removed itself from all of the contract and budget review processes. We have one simplified template that I think is much clearer and I think sponsors will be happier with, and it'll be less work for you in transferring the sponsor template into our template. No more HIPAA review by WIRB or HSD, and then you can submit the confidentiality agreement at the beginning of the process now instead of at the end. So that is all I have. Questions?
So many years ago when the process changed to have HSD do the budget and contract review, the contract review in particular was a direct result of the fact that in our division at least we had several contracts and consent form template languages that were not matching with respect to subject injury.
Okay.
So what was approved in the contract that was negotiated didn't match what the subject was being told in the consent form. And that raised a lot of alarms, and ultimately that was part of the reason that process started. So is it safe to say that it's the PI and the research team's responsibility now to make sure those match?
No, and that's something I left out, I'm sorry. So the question was, this is kind of how we used to do the process, and the issue was that the contract and the consent form weren't matching. So now when you get my final email saying you're clear to go to WIRB, you're going to get a final review letter that has instructions for how to fill out the WIRB submission form in certain places. So there's one question about who determines if the contract and consent form are consistent. And so now you've been marking the box that our institution has a policy. There's another box that says it's the sponsor or CRO's responsibility, and the sponsor or CRO has to sign it. So that's how we're ensuring that they're taking on that responsibility.
They have to sign what?
The submission form. There's a box on the WIRB submission form that they need to sign.
So if the IRB approval happens before the contract is finalized,
Then it'll be a change in research.
just want to make sure everyone's clear on that.
I'm not sure
We're also doing an auditing program. So our post-approval monitor is going to be doing a 100% audit to make sure that this new process is working. So I think we're doing it for about 6 months. So we will be going back after the fact and checking the consent form to see if it's consistent with the contract. Sponsors should be used to this. Working at WIRB previously, that it's common for the sponsors to take on that responsibility.
Question: do we have a process in place to protect us from we submit to WIRB, we get an initial review, the contract doesn't get finalized, or the sponsor decides to pull out? Is there a certain point where, well, now we're stuck with the IRB tab because we didn't have a finalized contract that agrees to that? Do we have something in place?
So the question was if we have any protection if we go through with the IRB review, they charge us for the IRB review and the sponsor pulls out. Do you have any idea how frequently that happens?
Usually the sponsor's paying more directly, so they just send the bill directly. I mean, it occasionally happens in a rare instance, but it's the same as all the sunk costs of staff time we put into that startup that we either walk away from or try to negotiate those. It's unfortunately not too common, but it happens, and sometimes teams eat the cost.
Okay.
Are you going to give us highlights from the new consent template?
I thought about printing it, but our printer has been very busy. I did bring a copy if anybody wants to see it, I can pass it around. But so there's three sections that are now required. So the medical record information section is now gone. It has been replaced with one sentence in the confidentiality section that just lets the subject know that information is going to be put in their medical record. If you have a financial conflict of interest, there is required text for that. And the question section has to include HSD's contact information. That's it. Everything else, I mean, there's guidelines, suggestions, but it's not required. You can use the sponsor's template if they want to change headers into questions, if they want different order, you've seen it. So very little required language. And we don't have a whole lot of financial conflicts of interest that at least come through me. So really it's one sentence in the confidentiality section and the HSD's contact information. Anybody want to see? I can pass it around.
Content just knowing, actually.
Okay.
And will the forms be available online for the access all the information for 5 months?
The 29th? Yes. May 29th. There were more questions, right? Yeah.
If I have a consent form that's currently in negotiation with the sponsor, the probably won't be sent out until after the June 1st date. Am I expected to use the new template and maybe do the consent form, or can I just use the previous template?
So the question was, if we're currently negotiating a consent form, does she need to convert it into the new template, or can it stay in the old? So if it was already, have you submitted to the HSD yet, or just to the sponsor? I guess the deadline is negotiated with WIRB on when it's submitted to HSD. So if it's going to be submitted to HSD after June 1st, I would recommend putting it into the new template. If you don't want to, though, I'm sure we can work something out, and I'll write a letter to WIRB and include it with the submission to use the old template.
And with the application where WIRB has to sign off the contract and the consent form match, that sign off is required to submit to WIRB?
WIRB will require. So the question was if it's WIRB's requirement for the signature. If you mark that box, which is now going to be a UW requirement, the submission form says that they either have to sign it or they have to include a letter stating that they understand the responsibilities.
So even if the contract isn't finalized, they can still sign off on that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just an attestation saying that we'll make sure that when the contract is finalized, that we'll.
But is it our responsibility to get the signature on the form, or is WIRB requesting the signature after our submission?
Whoever's filling out the submission form, it'll be their responsibility. So if you submit it to WIRB and it's not signed, they'll kick it back. They'll put it on hold.
So it's our responsibility
Yes.
to get the
If
signature.
they don't need an original, you can take a scan copy.
I understand, but it takes forever sometimes for them to sign stuff.
So we can just get it.
Yeah.
So we can just get an email though that says that they agree with that without signing it, or do we actually need a signature?
No, I'm pretty sure so this is a WIRB requirement, and we're just choosing this requirement from WIRB. I'm pretty sure the submission question says that they either have to sign it or you have to attach some sort of attestation saying that they understand. So I'm assuming that an email would be sufficient. Corey, do you remember at all?
The only times that I've seen people use that option, few and far between, back a couple of years ago. It was always signed on there, but what Rena was suggesting is you don't need the original. They don't need the wetty copy, but you can usually forward it to them on a PDF, say, hey, sign this, and this will just confirm that what's in the consent form is going to agree with your contract, and the same person should go get it back. And you submit it just like you do the PI signature at the end.
And I think that's something that if you're worried about it taking a long time, you could do it on the front end. So when you send them the initial consent form before you submit to HSD, you could submit that piece of the submission form and say, this is our process, can you go ahead and sign? Yeah?
You mentioned sometimes sponsors have requested changes to their authorizations. So since HSD and WIRB are no longer going to be reviewing those or asking those to be submitted, if for some reason a sponsor does want to make changes to the HIPAA authorization, what's the process? Who do they go to for those?
Yeah, so the question is, since HSD and WIRB are not reviewing the HIPAA authorization, if the sponsor pushes back and really wants to make changes, who do you go to? And that's UW Medicine Compliance, because it's their form, so you need to get permission from them to modify it.
Is there a contact? Would they know who to contact?
Our SOPs, the HSD-wide SOPs, just say UW Medicine Compliance. Do you have any idea who the point person would be over there?
Noelle has come to mind, but I don't know if she's the owner of that or not.
I think there's like a central email.
That would be nice to have that contact information on your website so at least somebody knows whom they
Okay.
contact if there's a question.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay.
So it looks like before we submit initially to you, we basically need to have the CRBB budget process finished. So they need to sign, they kind of need to sign off on that.
So I'm not exactly sure how CRBB is going to handle it, if they're going to make you wait until they're all completely done, or if they can do some sort of interim review, like, okay, this piece of the budget that's going to be described in the consent form, we're solid on this and we'll sign off on it. So you'll have to ask CRBB how they're going to handle that. It's their new process.
They're planning to roll out a communication about this too. Our office has been working with them as well on this, so they're aware of the changes and they're planning to.
I was going to ask, for folks who aren't able to make your in-person meetings, there'll be email communication or?
Yep, so it'll be announced in our e-news. We're recording this, so it'll be on our website. Hopefully everything goes well and it's recording. Yeah, so and then OSP is making an announcement and CRBB is making an announcement as well. Okay, thanks for coming.
Thanks, guys.